Okay, so we'll begin with the homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. So today is September 19th, 2015. And today we are taking sutta number 139 in the middle-length discourses. In Pali, this is called Araṇavibhanga Sutta. We know the word vibhanga we've had already with several of the earlier suttas. It means analysis, or here it's rendered exposition. And the word arana, it's a little bit of a puzzle. The commentary explains the word sarana, not in the sense of refuge, but this is sa plus rana. It explains this word as meaning with dust and with defilement. And so then it explains, you see, sa is a prefix meaning with, and the puzzle here is the word rana. And then it explains the word arana as meaning without dust, or in other words, without defilement. So it seems to be equating the word rana with dust. But there seems to be another meaning of the word rana, which is not acknowledged by the commentary, and that is battle or conflict. We have some Sri Lankan people here. Anybody named Ranasingha? Ranasingha, Ranavira? You? Okay, Ranavira. Vira means hero. Now Ranavira certainly doesn't mean hero of dust or hero of defilements, but it means hero in battle, right? And then there's a common Sri Lankan last name, Ranasingha. Singha is the same as the Pali Siya, which means lion. And so we don't have a lion of dust, but we have a lion, somebody who's courageous in battle will be Ranasingha, the lion of battle. So I think, are there any other Sri Lankan last names with Rana? Ranavira, Ranasingha. And Tunga, I think, means a peak. So Ranatunga would be the peak at the head of the battle. You see? Yeah. Well, I said Ranavira. Of Ranaviru. That's just a sort of singleized version of the the Ranavira is a more Sanskritized version. Ranaviru is just a singularized version. But it's the same name. Anyway, it seems that the meaning of Rana is conflict. And so Arana will be, as the title is translated here, without conflict, non-conflict. So this seems to be a series of pointers by the Buddha in how to avoid conflict. Okay, so let us look into the sutta itself. Okay, so we start when the Buddha is living at Savatthi in Jeta's grove, and then he addresses the monks and calls their attention, and then he says, I will teach you, he says, the Araṇavibhanga, that is the analysis of, or exposition of non-conflict. And now first, in paragraph 3, section 3 here, he's going to lay down what is called the concise teaching, the synopsis or summary, which is like, as I've explained before, this is the udesa. Which is almost like a sort of table of contents, a list of the topics that are going to be covered. And then that is followed by the vibhanga proper, the analysis of those topics. So here we come in paragraph 3 to the udesa, the list of topics. So he says, one should not pursue sensual pleasure which is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial, and one should not pursue attakila matano yogas, the practice of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. And then the way discovered by the Tathagata, that's by the enlightened one, avoids both extremes. It gives vision or insight. It gives knowledge, correct knowledge of the nature of things. It leads to peace, to abhinya, to higher knowledge, to sambodhaya, to awakening or enlightenment, to nibbana. Okay, then, you see, the sutta seems to deal with a variety of topics. It almost seems to shift from one topic to another, but all of these topics are in some way, you could say, comprised under the umbrella concept of avoiding conflict, especially teaching the Dhamma without getting into conflict and entanglements with others. Okay, so now it seems to shift almost in a different direction. One should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage. And knowing both, one should neither extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. And this has a somewhat different meaning than or different implications than might be immediately apparent. Okay, one should know how to define pleasure or happiness, and knowing that, one should pursue pleasure or happiness within oneself. Then one should not utter covert or hidden speech, and one should not utter overt, sharp speech. One should speak hurriedly, not hurriedly. One should not insist on local language, and one should not override or go beyond or bypass normal usage. This is the summary of the exposition of non-conflict. Okay, so he says this is the summary, this is the udesa, the list of topics that I'm going to treat. And as we go on, what seems to emerge from this is that a lot of the topics are concerned, I would say, not so much with what I would call the Dhamma itself, but how to expound the Dhamma, how to give a proper presentation of the Dhamma. Okay, so now we'll go into with the next paragraph, we start the actual Vibhanga, the analysis or exposition. Okay, so he says, first he mentions the sort of topic or the item from the table of contents. One should not pursue sensual pleasure, which is low, vulgar, coarse, ignoble, and unbeneficial. And one should not pursue self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and unbeneficial. Does anybody recognize this expression from another context? Exactly, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, from the Buddha's first discourse, when he first started to teach the Dhamma. In fact, when he first addressed the 5 ascetics, he said that one who has gone forth into the homeless life should not pursue or follow 2 extremes. Then he mentions the 2 extremes. One is the extreme of sensual indulgence, the other is the extreme of self-mortification. And what has to be pointed out, I don't think this is done often enough, is that when the Buddha uses this expression, he's teaching ascetics or monastics. That's why he says one should not pursue sensual pleasure. It doesn't mean that the Buddha is telling all of his disciples, those who are householders, lay people, give up sensual pleasures altogether. Because, it's natural for people living the household life to indulge in such sensual pleasures to some extent. But we could say what he's doing is setting up a kind of ideal. First, he's teaching ascetics or renunciants who have deliberately renounced sensual pleasures, not to revert to indulgence in sensual pleasures. Of course, if they indulge in sensual pleasures, then they're violating the very reason or intention in their going forth, which is to lead a life of renunciation. But when the Buddha is speaking to lay people, it's convenient in having the class in the library is that I could get the book that I want. Ravi, I see it, or Sandy? There's a gray book. It's called The Numerical Discourses of the Buddha. You see, Kaidi is close to it. Does it have a wrapper, the plastic wrapper? Numerical Discourses of the Buddha. It has the plastic wrapper. Oh, we don't want to break the wrapper. Anyway, I know the passage from... Okay. Yeah, there's a long sutta in the Anguttara Nikāya. It's a book of tens, number 91, in which the Buddha speaks of what he calls 10 kinds of persons in the world who enjoy sensual pleasures. And then he goes through different permutations of these types to arrive finally at the one who is the best or the ideal of those who enjoy sensual pleasures. And so of this, he says that the one enjoying sensual pleasures who seeks wealth righteously without violence, that is, who earns his living by right livelihood, not hurting others in pursuit of his livelihood, and makes himself happy and pleased, and shares it, and does meritorious deeds. So one uses a certain portion of the wealth to secure the well-being of oneself and one's family. Then one shares the wealth with others through the practice of generosity and does other meritorious deeds. And then, he says, and uses that wealth without being tied to it, infatuated with it, and blindly bogged down in it, seeing the danger or disadvantage in it, and understanding the escape or the release from the attachment to it. That person may be praised on 4 grounds: that he seeks wealth righteously, he makes himself happy and pleased, he shares the wealth and does meritorious deeds, and then he uses the wealth without being tied to it. And then he says of all of those who enjoy sensual pleasures, this is the best, the preeminent, the supreme, the one that I just described. So we could say that, there's a contrast between what the Buddha will expect from lay people who are earning a living and living in the world, and from those who have renounced the world. And so this teaching about not pursuing sensual pleasures, it's directly intended for those who have renounced the world, but it also sets up an ideal for those who are still earning wealth and still enjoying sensual pleasures, but to strive in the direction of the relinquishment of sensual pleasures. Okay, now the Buddha then raises the question with reference to what was this said. And then comes a phrase or an expression that's rather complicated in the Pali. Let's try to untangle it. The pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desire. Then we just skip over the adjectives. That is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever. It is the wrong way or the wrong practice. So we can say that the pursuit, to simplify it, we could say that the pursuit of sensual pleasures is a state beset by suffering and so on, and the wrong way. Then disengagement from the pursuit of the enjoyment of one whose pleasure is linked to sensual desires, or more simply, disengagement from the pursuit of sensual pleasures. This is a state without suffering, vexation, despair, and fever. Fever means the fever of passion. It is the right way. Then the pursuit of self-mortification. This was the mode of practice taken up in the Buddha's time, even still continues in India, of those ascetics who think that the way to purification, the way to liberation is through the torment of the body by undertaking these extreme ascetic practices, like sleeping on beds of nails or beds of thorns, going on long fasts, standing on one leg for days on end, immersing oneself in the water and staying in the water for hours and hours, or exposing the body. There's a practice, it's called, I think, the 5 fires. You light fires in each of the major directions on the hottest days of the year. Around one, fire to the north, east, south, and west. Then the 5th fire is the overhead sun. And then one stands there enduring the pain of the heat. And that's considered, a noble, purifying practice. Okay, but the Buddha says that this is just a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it's the wrong way. And then disengagement or detachment or relinquishing that pursuit of self-mortification, that's the state without suffering, and that is the right way. Okay, so now the Buddha is setting up like these two extremes, and then he says that the middle way discovered by the Tathagata avoids both these extremes. So the function of the middle way, the reason why the middle way becomes the way to liberation for the Buddha is because it's the way that gives rise to vision or insight, direct insight into the nature of things. It gives knowledge, comprehension of the nature of things. It leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. And then what is that Noble Eightfold? What is that middle way? It's just the Noble Eightfold Path. So again, this is referring back to the Buddha's first discourse, to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So all of this should be fairly familiar to those who know, who are already acquainted with the first discourse. But here, if we take this in context of the rest of the sutta, it seems that the Buddha's purpose in bringing this here is not to teach the monks anything new as far as their actual knowledge goes, but to show them, this is my interpretation, the right way to teach the Dhamma. When you're teaching, don't encourage people to indulge in sensual pleasures. Don't encourage people to undertake self-mortification, but teach them to follow the middle way, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, now we'll come to the next section. Okay, so he says, one should know what it is to extol and what it is to disparage. The Pali words here are usadana and upasadana. Usadana is like extolling, lifting up, pushing up. And upasadana is almost corresponds exactly to the English expression, colloquial expression, to put down, to put somebody down. And so then the Buddha says, knowing both, one should not extol nor disparage, but should teach only the Dhamma. And with reference to what was this said, okay, from what comes next, we could now see the connection to the previous passage on the two extremes and the middle way. So it says, how does there come to be the extolling and disparaging and failure to teach only the Dhamma? So he says, when one says, all those engaged in the pursuit, let's simplify it, all those engaged in the pursuit of sensual pleasures are beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and they have entered upon the wrong way, one thus disparages some. When one says all those who are detached from the pursuit of sensual pleasures are without suffering and so on, and they have entered upon the right way, one thus extols some. Now notice that the key idea here is that one is extolling some people and disparaging other people. And so the point in the Buddha's method of teaching is not to extol individuals as such because of the particular path that they've taken, but rather, well, actually, okay, the same thing is then developed with regard to those who follow self-mortification. Okay, when one says all those engaged in self-mortification are beset by suffering and that they have entered on the wrong way, one is disparaging some. When one says all those disengaged from the pursuit of self-mortification are without suffering and they have entered on the right way, one thus extols some. Again, when one teaches in that way, then one is phrasing one's teaching by way of praising and disparaging individuals or people. Okay, I just want to skip over what comes next because it just is along the same line and get to paragraph 8. Okay, so how does there come to be neither extolling nor disparaging, but teaching only the Dhamma? Okay, when one does not say, all those engaged in the pursuit of sensual pleasures have entered upon the wrong way, but says instead, the pursuit is a state beset by suffering, vexation, despair, and fever, and it is the wrong way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. And similarly, when one does not say, all those who are detached from the pursuit of sensual pleasures have entered upon the right way, but says instead, the disengagement is a state without suffering, and so on, and it is the right way, then one teaches only the Dhamma. Okay, now here when you see teaching the Dhamma, you think that means teaching the Buddha's teaching the Buddha's doctrine. But the word Dhamma has a number of meanings, and here what I see to be underlying this is one meaning of Dhamma as the principle. So there's a difference between teaching in terms of persons, which is when you're praising some, disparaging others, and teaching in terms of the principle, or you could say the rationale. So here the principle is that the principle is that the pursuit of sensual pleasures is beset by suffering and the wrong way. So when one teaches in that way, then one is teaching simply the principle without praising and saying, these people are detached from sensual pleasures, they are so wonderful, so pure, so saintly, so holy. Those people just indulge in sensual pleasures, they're so wretched, so vile, so low in character. But instead one is avoiding praising and disparaging, and instead just elucidating the principle. Okay, and then the same basic principle, I could say, basic way of understanding it can apply to each of the following paragraphs. I don't have to elaborate upon them. But you see, in each case, one is avoiding praising and extolling some, just those who are engaged in what we would take to be the right practice. One avoids disparaging those who are engaged in what we take to be the wrong practice. Instead, one is saying, this is the wrong practice, this is the right practice. avoid the wrong practice, follow the right practice. So what's called teaching the Dhamma means explaining the principles, the guidelines, without using one's teaching as a way to, say, play particular individuals off against one another. Does this seem clear at this point? Any questions at this point before we go further? So, should we move on? Okay, so now the Buddha brings up a somewhat different topic. Maybe this is sort of taking off. Actually, I would see this as continuing along the line of avoiding the two extremes and following the middle way. So it says one should know how to define pleasure or happiness. The Pali word is sukha, which has both meanings. And knowing that, one should pursue pleasure or happiness ajjatang, which means within oneself, an internal happiness. Okay, so why was this said? Then the Buddha speaks about the 5 chords of, or 5 kinds or objects of sensual pleasure. These are form, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, which are agreeable, likable, desirable, provocative of desire or lust. So those are the 5 objects of sensual pleasure. And then the pleasure and joy, sukha somanassa, that arise dependent on these 5 objects of sensual pleasure are called sensual pleasure. So the kind of sensual pleasure that's to be avoided is the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on delightful objects of the 5 senses. And then the Buddha says that this kind of pleasure, sensual pleasure, he calls it a filthy pleasure. And here the word filthy, in English, it tends to have moralistic implications. Whereas in Pali, milha, it just suggests something like the dirt on the ground. And it's a coarse pleasure, an ignoble pleasure. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should not be pursued, developed, cultivated, but that it should be feared. Again, this is especially the case for those who are entered upon the homeless life. Of course, it's attraction to the sensual pleasures that lead one to give up the homeless life and then sometimes to commit evil, even unwholesome deeds, which will lead to the bad realms of rebirth. And then in contrast, the Buddha is now speaking about a higher kind of pleasure. This is the pleasure or happiness to be found ajjatang, within oneself or internally. So this is the pleasure of the 4 jhanas. And then the Buddha calls this the bliss of renunciation, nekkhamma sukha. The bliss of seclusion or solitude, paviveka sukha. The bliss of peace, upassama sukha. And even I think it's sambodha sukha, the bliss of enlightenment. Which doesn't mean that attaining the jhanas themselves is equivalent to enlightenment. But the jhanas are part of the Noble Eightfold Path leading to Nibbana, and the bliss of the jhanas are said to give a foretaste of the bliss of Nibbana. And then the Buddha then says of this kind of happiness, that it should be pursued, should be developed, should be cultivated, and should not be feared. Okay, so it was reference to this, that it was said one should know how to define, or let's say to distinguish different types of pleasure and happiness, and then one should pursue pleasure within oneself. And pleasure within oneself, we say, means the bliss of the jhanas. And this, even if one doesn't achieve the bliss of the jhanas, I mean, that's a very rare achievement. But even what strikes me about the practice of meditation is that, people that they think in order to be happiness, you have to get this, you have to acquire that, you need, well, it's all right to have a nice house, but some people think they need 4 or 5 homes, very impressive cars. And constantly, the whole commercial culture continually provokes in us the idea that you're not happy unless you possess increasing amounts of material possessions, which are distinguished by their glitter, their novelty, by their ability to help you outdo your neighbors. And so all of this is a kind of outward pursuit of happiness, which is constantly being undermined by the fact that one is never satisfied with what one gets. But even if you're sitting in meditation with a wandering mind, but after some time, once the mind starts to settle down, you can see that you have all of the requisites of happiness are just within oneself. And then if one continues to pursue this practice, over time, the different accumulations of distraction and disturbance start to bubble off, and then springs of inner happiness come welling up from deep within, and then one feels a contentment simply with having this mind and body, even this very flawed mind and body. So ascetics who are living in forest hermitages, ascetic monks, I mean, well, you can't see them so easily, but often the only thing they own are their robes, their alms bowl, maybe a few little medicines, toothbrush, toothpaste, a little kuti or hut, and they're perfectly happy. Whereas you have well, Buddha says you shouldn't refer to people, but your Koch brothers and your Donald Trump. I only have 4 billion, that guy has 6 billion. It doesn't look good on my resume that I'm $2 billion behind him in income. Okay, the next section, here one should not utter what's called covert speech, rahu vadam. Rahu would be like speaking perhaps privately about somebody, critically about somebody in private. Let's see if we can unpack it by looking at it. Okay, and one should not utter overt sharp speech. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said. Here, when one knows covert speech, private or hidden speech, to be untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial, one should on no account utter it. Okay, this speech has to be knocked down on 2 accounts. It's untrue. Incorrect is just a synonym. So it's untrue and it's without any benefit. So on both grounds, one doesn't utter it. Okay, when one knows covert speech to be true and correct, but unbeneficial, then the Buddha says one should try not to utter it. Or actually the Pali text says one should train oneself not to utter it. But when one knows covert speech to be true, correct, and beneficial, one may utter it knowing the time to do so. I'm trying to think of instances where this works. Maybe some of you can help me out. Speaking privately. Oh, I think this would... Actually, if one takes this to be speaking privately to another person, actually this makes sense. When I was reading it last night, I was interpreting it to mean talking about another person, but not in their presence. But if we take it to mean speaking privately to another person about what is, saying, I want to speak to you, please come into my office, then it makes sense, or at least I could think of, numerous cases where it works. So when it's correct what one is going to bring up, to criticize another person for, or to discuss with that person, and it's beneficial, then it makes sense to speak. Notice, knowing the time to do so. So if your son is playing baseball with his friends, and you found out that, he didn't do his homework, or he didn't do the house duties, you don't call him away from his baseball game and start criticizing him. But you have to find the right opportunity, know the right time. And also this works within monastic life, that when one monk is to criticize another privately, he'll call that monk when it's inopportune time. Not if the monk is sort of sitting in meditation, you come to his room and then you sort of shake him out and say, come out. You didn't do the dishes. You left your dishes on the table and just got up and walked away without washing them. But you wait till, he's maybe just taking a walk or he just shows that he's not engaged with anything else. Other occasions when it's useful to speak not directly to a person, but this would be covert speech, true, correct, and beneficial. One is speaking to somebody else about another person at the right time. Are there such situations?
Well, perhaps looking for counsel on how to approach an individual or situation.
That's a good example. Yeah. So you want to get some advice from another about how do you deal with this person.
Also, in the booklet you sent me about monasteries in Sri Lanka, it says, be mindful, don't ever speak directly. Like, Sinhalese people are very indirect in criticism, so I'm not sure if that is along those same lines, but you wouldn't criticize, like in New York we say whatever we think for the most part.
I think this applies more to the next section that we're going to come to. Any other ideas? Anyway, it's something to think about. Okay, let us come to the next section. Okay, when one knows, now the Buddha is speaking about, or with reference to what's called overt, sharp speech. And this is sammukha. Sammukha means in the presence. But if covert speech can include speaking directly to somebody, say, about their faults, their omissions, and so on, then overt sharp speech might mean criticizing somebody in a group, perhaps. I have to say, the commentary just provides word glosses. It doesn't exemplify what is meant by these expressions, so it's hard to know exactly what's intended. Okay, so when one knows overt, sharp speech to be untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial, of course, then one should not utter it. When one knows overt, sharp speech to be true, correct, and unbeneficial, then one should train oneself not to utter it. But when one knows overt, sharp speech to be true, correct, and beneficial, one may utter it knowing the time to do so. Yeah, so if we take covert speech to be speaking privately to a person to criticize them in private, then overt, sharp speech would be speaking openly in a group to somebody, maybe somebody who's been a real persistent troublemaker, refuses to take advice from others, and when given to them privately, and is disturbing the whole group because of his behavior. And in that case, it becomes necessary to call that person into the presence of the group, even to speak to them. Initially, perhaps one should start speaking politely, but sometimes we have people who are always out to defend themselves and then to try to turn the tables on their accusers and accuse the other person of faults, till sometimes one has to speak to them sharply. And even, we've had experience like this in our monastic group in Sri Lanka, to expel them from the monastery. Yeah. I remember we had one monk in our group in Sri Lanka who started to make trouble during the time when I was there. I had gone to Singapore, this was in 2001, 2002, while he and his disciple were still at the monastery, and they continued to make trouble for all of the other monks. So all of the other monks had to sort of meet together, and they decided, I think with the advice of the Mahanayaka, that's the chief monk of this division of the Sangha, to ask him to leave. And so they asked him to leave. Then I had an experience that summer. I went from Singapore to Germany. Now this monk is of European origins. And so I was invited to go to the Vesak celebration. This was in May at the Hamburg Buddhist Society. And so there was a woman named Monica who drove me to the center to the headquarters of the Buddhist Society. And then we got out of the car and she said, there's another monk inside. Then I looked through the window and I saw the back. I saw the yellow color, the particular shade of orange of exactly the kind of robe this other monk in Sri Lanka always would wear. And that monk was always a little bit unshaven, and the person that I saw inside was somewhat unshaven. So the thought came into my mind, well, we don't believe in God, but I said, oh my God, he's there. How did I get into this quagmire? Sure, since he's European, he probably came back to Europe for summer, and they somebody invited him to come to this Vesak celebration, and now I somehow got into this difficulty. And now I'm sure when we go inside, even though I wasn't in the Sangha at that time, I wasn't in the monastery, but he knew that I was a member of that group, so I'm imagining as soon as I step in the door, he's going to confront me. And what am I going to say to him? I'll say, but I wasn't there. And he'll say, I knew you were the plotter. You were behind the plot. So all these thoughts are bubbling through my mind. I'm thinking, maybe I should say to Monica, let's skip it. Tell him that I'm sick. But then I thought, you have to be courageous, have to be patient, just contain yourself, get hold of yourself. We come into the room, and I don't see another monk. But I see one of the men at the celebration is wearing kind of copper orange t-shirt, and he has short cropped hair, and a little bit unshaven. But there was a Buddhist nun also in the room. So Monica either saw the man who was sitting against the window with the copper shirt and short cropped hair and thought he was a monk, or she was referring to the nun as another monk. But my mind was building up this whole drama, which just suddenly came crashing to the ground. I was looking around, where is he? Where is he? Okay, that's a diversion. In the Shakespearean dramas, they have usually a little scene someplace in the drama. They call it the comic relief. Okay, so when one knows overt sharp speech is correct and beneficial, then one may utter it, again, knowing the proper time to do so. Okay, the next section, one should speak unhurriedly, not hurriedly. And then what is the reason for this? And this is just almost like common sense, that when one speaks hurriedly, one's body gets tired, one's mind gets excited, one's voice is strained, one's throat becomes hoarse, and the speech of one who speaks hurriedly is indistinct and hard to understand. But when one speaks unhurriedly, one's body doesn't grow tired, one's mind doesn't become excited, and so on, and one's speech is distinct and easy to understand. So all of this is just common sense. Okay, then comes the next passage. One should not insist on local language, and one should not override normal usage. So it was said, and with reference to what was this said. And the word translated, or the expression translated local language, is Janapada Niruti. Janapada usually means a country or a region, and Niruti is the language or expression. And one should not override normal usage. This is samanyang. This is the common designations, the normal way of expression. Okay, for what reason is this said? Okay, first the Buddha explains how there is insistence on local language and overriding of normal usage. And now in India, in the Buddha's time, there were many different regions and districts, most of them in the area where the Buddha traveled used a variation on Magadhi. Magadhi would have been the language of the state of Magadha, what corresponds now to Bihar. And so this language would have been a derivative originally derived from Vedic Sanskrit, but infiltrated or absorbed many colloquial type expressions. There would be different changes in phonology or sound values. But the Buddha traveled into many regions, going from probably the furthest to the west would be where Delhi is now, New Delhi, and going to the east into what is now West Bengal. And so there would be different, especially for objects of ordinary usage, they would have different terms. Whereas the more philosophical terms would have been very similar from region to region. So I was saying in different localities, they call the same thing. We have in one region Pati, another region Patta, another region Vita, another region Seirava, another region Darupa, another region Pona, another region Pisila. Nyanamoli just came up with a variety of English words, but it's intended to refer to the same thing, which is a dish. And so the Buddha says, whatever they call it in such and such locality, one speaks accordingly, firmly adhering to the expression, insisting only this is correct, anything else is wrong. That is how there comes to be insistence on local language and overriding normal usage. It's a little difficult to see how this would apply today. I don't know, I'd have some examples.
Well, I've been taking part in the Gentai retreat, and took an hour off from it to be here. There was, to break the rules, so to speak, from the previous page, one individual corrected me several times in how to fold a cloth. Am I supposed to hold this thing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Just like this? Okay. One person corrected me on how to fold a cloth.
Yeah.
Another, and he also corrected me on how to place a sutra book on the table. And two or three other things. Now he's really a very nice guy, and he's trying to be helpful. Yeah. But my interpretation is that he was doing something that I think Sam might have been alluding to, and that's looking at the cultural values of Chinese culture and Chinese Buddhism specifically, and looking at it in a kind of generalizing it as though it were the rule. And I think that might be analogous to the language aspect, because when we insist on using a particular word as though it had ultimate reality or ultimate truth, as opposed to another word which is really just as good in a relative sense, and it's a relative issue anyway, that might be, I know I'm being very wordy.
No.
But I'm trying to make an analogy and say, language is a reflection of culture. Yeah. And so when I say, no, my culture is right and your culture is wrong, I think it sounds to me as though that's very much the issue here.
Yeah, actually that's a good analogy, actually, and it also makes me think of a few things. I'm finding it a little difficult to relate to language, but to customs, like, okay, the last few days I was at the Sri Lankan temple in Queens. So when they serve the food, they offer me, do you want a spoon? But none of them are using spoons. They're all using their hands to eat from the food. Now here, if I were to start using my hands to eat, everybody would look like I was crude and cultured because it's not, part of the traditional Chinese culture to eat with the hands. So instead here, usually I use spoon, but we could use chopsticks. Whereas in Sri Lankan temple, if you ask for, can I have chopsticks, I doubt that they have them there.
I think to convey a message effectively, though, you have to know your audience. And I think that's just simply what the Buddha is saying. Going back to what you said earlier, this is a sutta to teach monks how to study Dhamma. It goes without saying, you have to know your audience, first of all, but you can't speak, in one way, knowing that you're using analogies that might be useful or common to Chinese people when you're teaching.
But notice now we have to take the second part of the Buddha statement. Okay, he says, whatever they call it in such and such a locality, one speaks accordingly. Wait. Okay, let's just take the part that begins. And how does there come to be non-insistence on local language and non-overriding of normal usage? So here in different localities, they call the same thing, a dish, a bowl, a vessel. So whatever they call it in such and such a locality, without adhering to that expression, one speaks accordingly, thinking these venerable ones are speaking with reference to this. So that is how there comes to be non-insistence on local language and non-overriding of normal usage. A little dense, the way of expression. What I would take it to mean is that one adapts oneself to the way things are expressed in a particular region, or we could say more broadly, one adapts to the customs of the particular group in which one is living without insisting that this is the only way. So if one is in the big Buddha hall in the Chinese monastery and a monk says, this is the correct way to close the sutra and put it on the stand, then one follows that, thinking, this isn't the absolute truth, but this is the convention, and under these circumstances, one conforms to the convention.
Just a point. This is all under conflict. So what we're trying to do is avoid the conflict with locality, because they may have, their minds may be twisted by somebody saying we're doing something not their way.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the conflict.
Exactly, yeah.
Do I have this backwards when it says one should not insist on local language? It seems like maybe it's the opposite. We should insist on the local language. I shouldn't go to India and assume everyone speaks English.
Yeah. Well, you see, the word here it comes out maybe more clearly, abhiniveseya, which has the idea of being attached to it.
I mean, one's own language. It seems like the local language would be desirable because that's what the people would speak.
Because you're teaching, so you want to maybe not insist on what your form is that you're accustomed to. Maybe you want to say, okay, I'm flexible here.
Of course, flexibility is what's called for, but I think this is not insisting, not adhering to. Maybe it's the language of the particular region. One doesn't, I don't know, I have to say it's a bit obscure to me.
But is it saying to the teacher? Because if it's saying to the teacher, don't insist on your local language. Like if I go, like in the example that was just given, if I go to India, I shouldn't insist on everyone speaking English.
Yeah, that seems to be the sense.
Because it's saying one should think here, these venerable ones, it seems, are speaking with reference to this. So if I go there and I hear, another word, like if we say, for example, I don't know, like in British English, when if I go like a banger or mash or something, I'm not going to say these are fried. I don't have to go, if I go to England and I say, I'd like some bangers and mash, I'm not going to walk up to the counter and expect that I'm going to get potatoes and give me some fries and whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe it's saying these venerable ones, like when you go somewhere to teach the Dhamma, like make sure that you can in your mind say, oh, I know what they're referring to, but then be adaptable is that pick up their local language.
Yeah, I think that's the sense. Yeah. Did you have some comment back there?
Yeah, I was just going to say maybe you're saying that you're not asking the minority to conform to the majority.
Wait, I'm not getting the sound so clearly.
Maybe you're saying that you're not asking the minority to conform to the majority. It's like saying.
Oh, I see.
The English, so everyone who's speaking Spanish in the country should learn English as well. So the local language is English, and you're asking Spanish-speaking people to also learn English. So maybe that's what he's saying.
I'm not sure that's the implication here.
The local language is English, and insisting on the local.
I mean, that's a matter of sort of policy considerations, whereas this is advice for a monk who's gone out to teach the Dhamma. So it seems the point is to be, I would say, flexible as regarding terminology, and not to insist that the particular terminology that one knows oneself, that one is familiar with, has some kind of absolute value to it. And one could see this passage, so it's not brought out explicitly, but it may be sort of implicitly undercutting the Brahminic belief that the language of the Vedas, which they call Sanskrit, was in some way a sacred language, the eternal language, the language which was the language of divine creation. This was a Brahminic belief, and it could be that, well, the passage, as I said, isn't stating that explicitly, but it's undercutting the absolute value of any language, the absolute validity of any language. Even though the Pali tradition has adopted pretty much the same attitude with regard to the Pali language, so that they say in the Pali commentaries that if you take an infant who's just been born, somehow, and you put him out in the woods so that he grows up without any exposure to human beings, and then at the age of maturity, 14 or 15, he comes into human contact and has to express himself, then he'll be speaking the Mula Bhasa, the root language, or the Sambhava Bhasa, the natural language, which is Pali. So if anybody wants to learn Pali well, just go off into seclusion. Don't expose yourself to any English books and newspapers and so on. Naturally, as the familiarity with English wears off, you'll be speaking Pali. Yes?
I think, Vande, I agree with your last explanation of that Brahminic and Vedic view,
Yeah.
which was predominant at the time of Buddha. And
Yeah.
when he started his teachings, then he wanted to reach out to the common man.
Yeah.
It was Pali.
Yeah.
Maybe with respect to that, it came out that there should not be any insistence on Sanskrit. For example, even now in India, for some of the exams, where there was liberty.
Wait, it's good if you have the mobile microphone.
There's a mute button, mute and on, just push it to on.
Okay, this is much better. So, Bhante, I totally agree with you. It must be in that, reference where at the time of Buddha, it was Sanskrit that was predominant and was spoken by the Brahmins. And then when he wanted to take Dhamma to each and everybody and to common man, and common man's language was Pali at the time. And maybe,
There would have been a variety of languages, dialects over northeast India. Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely Sanskrit was one which was kept secret with, one section of the community. And even what I was referencing was today also, when we say that languages, there are many languages, like thousands of languages in India. And there's a liberty that, one person whosoever wants to learn one language should have the liberty and, flexibility to learn whatever one wants.
Yeah.
But we've seen recently that some views who are just against, Buddhism or whatever, they'll say, okay, in this exam, Pali is out.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
in civil services exam, they have taken out Pali.
Wow.
Entirely.
Wow.
So, and they're trying to do Sanskrit, everything in Sanskrit. I mean, definitely teach Sanskrit, but don't take something. I mean, if somebody wants to teach Sanskrit, it should be fine, but don't take something out from curriculum. And so maybe, with regards to that, it came out that it should not be like one preference should be given to just one language which is understood by just one section of the community and not everyone and all.
Okay. I just want to bring up what would be an example of overriding common usage that doesn't refer to different languages, but this is, some people think that, okay, in following Buddhism, I shouldn't use the word I or myself, because if I do that, then I'm sort of underlying that usage as a subtle attachment to the idea of the ego or the self. And so they'll say, well, this collection of 5 aggregates has to go to the bathroom.
She mentioned about the secret of Sanskrit was spoken by the higher class or caste. Do you think that's what, in the earlier section, the Buddha was referring to when he says, don't speak in private? Sorry. When the Buddha was saying, don't speak in, harsh words or extol in private, is that what do you think that might have been?
No. I think that's just referring to ordinary speech, not to a particular language.
But then Sanskrit was only spoken amongst the Brahmin class. It wasn't the common language.
First, I don't think that Sanskrit is a literary language. It wasn't a spoken language. Maybe during the Vedic period, which was 1,500 years before the Buddha. 1,500 to 100 to 1,000 years before the Buddha, maybe it was a spoken language. But by the time of the Buddha, probably everybody in Northeast India was speaking some dialect based on Magadhi. In Western India, there would be pretty much all of those languages belong to the same family. They're descended from Vedic Sanskrit, but they undergo phonological changes to make it easier to enunciate. The grammar becomes somewhat simplified, as we see if we compare Pali and Sanskrit. So Sanskrit pretty much was the language. I don't know that it was ever a spoken language. It was a literary language. Brahmins can use it to speak to each other. And then I think the great classical poets and dramatists use Sanskrit for their poetry and the drama. What's the name of the famous Sanskrit dramatist? Kalidasa, is that it? Yeah, he wrote his dramas in Sanskrit. But the spoken language, I don't think so.
If perhaps there was another language that was the root of the Prakriti and also of Sanskrit. And also of Sanskrit, because if Sanskrit were not a spoken language by the people, then the other languages could not derive from it.
Right.
No, that's not the case. That the other languages derive from Vedic Sanskrit, which would have been the language used in the Vedas, which is an older form of Sanskrit.
Yes. Whether
it was ever a spoken language, that I don't know. It might have been. But all of this is so I'm not a philologist and I haven't studied the origin of the Indian languages. I just know that they call them the classification of the three main periods of the Indian languages: the old Indo-Aryan languages, which is taken to be Vedic Sanskrit; Middle Indo-Aryan languages, which includes Pali, variety of Prakrits. Then classical Sanskrit actually comes later, formulated by Panini and Patanjali and the Sanskrit grammars. And then comes modern Indo-Aryan languages, which include Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, maybe Hindustani. So they're all sort of within a stream of evolution, which goes back even to, earlier language, which then those who spoke it spread out over parts of Asia and even Europe, so that there are affinities between Greek and Sanskrit, English and Sanskrit, so that they're distant, very distant cousins. Okay, I just want to wrap up the sutta. Okay, in the final section, the Buddha just sort of lines up all of the different dichotomies that he's established in the sutta, stating that one is on the side of, or a state with conflict. It's an Araṇavibhanga. So the pursuit of sensual pleasures is a state with conflict. Disengagement from the pursuit of sensual pleasures is a state without conflict. The pursuit of self-mortification is a state with conflict. Disengagement from self-mortification is a state without conflict. The middle way is a state without conflict. Extolling and disparaging is a state with conflict. Not extolling and not disparaging, but teaching just the Dhamma or the principle is a state without conflict. Sensual pleasures is a state with conflict. The bliss of renunciation and so forth is a state without conflict. Covert speech that is untrue, incorrect, and unbeneficial, and covert speech that is true, correct, and unbeneficial, both are states with conflict. Covert speech that is true, correct, and beneficial is a state without conflict. Overt sharp speech that is untrue, overt sharp speech that is true and unbeneficial, both are states with conflict. Overt sharp speech that is true, correct, and beneficial is a state without conflict. Speaking hurriedly is a state with conflict. I'm speaking hurriedly now. Speaking unhurriedly is a state without conflict. Insisting on local language and overriding normal usage is a state with conflict. Not insisting on local language and not overriding normal usage is a state without conflict. Okay, then the Buddha says, you should train yourselves thus. We will know the state with conflict, and we will know the state without conflict, and knowing these, we will enter upon the way without conflict. Then the Buddha praises the monk named Subhuti, saying Subhuti is a clansman, Kulaputta, a young man, who has entered upon the way without conflict. And who is this Subhuti? According to the commentary, he's said to have been the younger brother of Anathapindika. Anathapindika was the Buddha's chief donor, lay supporter. And Subhuti interestingly, he doesn't play a very prominent role in the Pali Suttas. There are just very few places that mention him. But yet, when the Buddha established categories of great disciples in different areas, and he appointed Subhuti to be the great disciple, the foremost disciple in two areas. One area is that of those who dwell arana, without conflict. The other area is the foremost of those who are worthy of offerings. On what basis, why he appoints Subhuti to those titles? It's a bit puzzling to me. Like, why does he pass over Sariputta, Mahakassapa, some of the other great disciples, and appoints Subhuti, who's very obscure in the Pali Canon, to those positions? I don't know. What's interesting is that Subhuti, though he's mentioned only in a few places in the Pali Canon, but then in the Mahayana Prajnaparamita Sutras, he becomes the primary conversationalist or interlocutor with the Buddha on the perfection of wisdom. So we see this in the Diamond Sutra, 8,000 line all of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So it's mainly Subhuti speaking together with the Buddha, sometimes with Sariputta or some others. And if you want to see Subhuti in person, well, you don't see him in person, but if you go along what's called the Bodhi path here at the monastery, he is at the top of the path facing the great Buddha hall on the left. So you see the image of Subhuti. And you see he is sitting with, it looks like a palm leaf manuscript on his lap. Probably that is because he is the foremost exponent of the Prajnaparamita. So that might be the collection of Prajnaparamita Sutras on his lap. Okay, if there are just a few questions, and then we could come together after the lunch for more discussion. Any quick questions?
So what on page 1084 at the top?
Excuse me?
At the top of page 84 in paragraph 10, it says, but when one knows covert speech to be true, correct, and beneficial, one may utter it, knowing the time to do so. Does it point? It doesn't really explain how one knows when the time to do so, what the time to do so is.
Yeah.
In this sutta, but I was wondering if there's any other references or anything else that could point to this, because it's interesting, because then it sort of points to there being a precise time to actually do something, and then the question then becomes, how does one know when to do that?
Yes, an interesting question. I'm just trying to think whether there are any other suttas. I know there are numbers of suttas which speak about, in fact, it's said to be like one of the important qualities in a teacher is knowing the right time. Like in the numerical discourses, the Anguttara Nikāya. Ooh! Okay. It wasn't open, I was afraid it was open. Yeah, the sutta is Anguttara Nikāya, Book of Fives, number 167. It speaks about the proper way to to reprove or to criticize others. And so the first of these is that one should consider, I will speak at a proper time, not at an improper time. Anyone could look at that sutta. It's a little difficult. I'd have to sort of read it quickly here and then sort of digest it and see whether it develops the theme of time. But maybe it's just an intuitive matter that one knows that in a situation where you don't interrupt somebody who's engaged in an activity, or you don't embarrass that person in front of a group when the person is still amenable to correction. Okay, maybe we should go up and take the midday meal now and then come back, let's say 12:15. So we'll end. And Sandy just reminded me that, our organization, Buddhist Global Relief, will be having the walk to feed the hungry. This is to take place on Saturday, October 31st. So every year we have this walk whereby we try to raise funds for the projects of Buddhist Global Relief, which provide, the mission of Buddhist Global Relief is to combat chronic hunger and malnutrition, either in a variety of ways, through direct food relief, by sponsoring projects that promote ecologically sustainable agriculture, by promoting the education of poor girls in disadvantaged communities, and by enabling women to start right livelihood projects to support their families. So this is an information brochure about the walk, and I will be present at this walk. In fact, I will be doing 5 walks this fall from Michigan next weekend, next Sunday. And Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, California, New York City, October 31st, and November 8th in Wilmington, Connecticut. If anybody also lives in Connecticut, they could join the Connecticut walk. And that reminds me, before we break, next week after the class, I'll need a ride to the airport. I think it's the LaGuardia Airport. Would anybody going in that direction?
Next week it's going to be during the retreat. You want to do a class?
I still want to do the class. How many people are going on the retreat? So there'll be 3, but I want to do the class because otherwise I'll be missing several classes in October. And then there'll be too few classes.
What time is the class?
I think it's about 5 o'clock. But if you'll be on the retreat, then I don't want you to leave. If somebody else is going in that direction. But I can go to the airport early, it doesn't matter. Well, you just settle. Johnny raised his hand. Are you going in that direction? If anybody is going towards Queens, then it's the easiest way. You'll be on the retreat. No, I don't want you to interrupt the retreat. Okay. Okay, so we have a volunteer.
I'm always available.
Okay. I'll just recite the sharing of the merits. Yeah. Okay, so we do the sharing of the merits. Akasata Jabumata Deva Naga Mehedika Punyanta Nanumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam akasata chabumata Deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam akasata chabumata Deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang etavata cham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabhe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabhe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagupadaya vichihitato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu vibhutim. Oh yeah. Oh, okay.
I got a ride. I didn't drive today.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we end with 3 half bows to the Buddha.
How's the family?
Maybe the sutta is so clear that maybe my explanation is so clear. No questions, no problems. Anytime you have a question, you can ask. That's the right situation. What is the right time to speak? Oh, I see. That's what he meant by the right time. The woman who asked about the right time, is she still here? Because I thought, while I was walking down, I remembered there's a sutta. It occurs in the Anguttara Nikāya, Book of Sixes. Let me see how it goes. It's a question about the right time. It's the right time to approach a monk who's developed in mind in order to ask questions. This is a discussion amongst the monks, and different monks present different opinions. And I think it's Mahakachana who enters the discussion, and he says the right time is whenever one's mind is overcome by any of the 5 hindrances. If anybody wants to reach for that copy of the numerical discourses, Sandy, I think it's the same book that you brought to me during the class. Excuse me? You gave it to Kaidi.
How does Suki know everything?
Okay.
I guess it's 12.
Oh, yeah. This is after coming back from their alms round. The monks are sitting around and they're discussing they use the expression, what is the proper occasion for going to see an esteemed elder? Okay, so one monk says when that esteemed elder has come back from his alms round and he's sitting erect with his legs crossed, having established mindfulness before him. That's just when he starts his meditation. That's the proper occasion for going to see him. So then another monk says, no, that's not the right time. It's when the monk is, he says that's not the right time because he's still fatigued after his alms round. But in the evening, when he's emerged from meditation and is sitting in the shade of his dwelling, holding his body upright with his legs crossed, that's the time to see him. Another says, no, that's not the right time, because at that time he's focusing on an object of meditation. But rather the right time is when night begins to fade and the dawn is coming, and then he's sitting with his legs crossed, holding his body erect. Oh, but then another monk says that's not the right time, because then his body is fresh after the night's sleep, and so it's easy for him to meditate. Then finally, it's Mahakachana says, in the presence of the Blessed One, I heard and learned this, that there are 6 occasions for going to see an esteemed elder. 1 is when one's mind is overcome by sensual lust. 2nd, when the mind is overcome by ill will. 3rd, the mind is overcome by dullness and drowsiness. 4th, the mind is overcome by restlessness and remorse. 6th, the mind is overcome by doubt. And the 7th, that's the 5th, and then the 6th is when a monk does not know what object to use for meditation in order to reach the destruction of the asavas, the taints. So that's the right time.
But that doesn't coincide with when the monk might be getting up from his meditation, or it still doesn't really answer the question when...
Yeah. It answers it from the point of view of the inquirer, but it doesn't settle the issue from the point of view of the one who's going to be asked. Right. So if my mind is overcome by sensual lust, I still have to find what is the right time to go to him. I'm not going to barge in on him when he's sitting in his... But generally the right time would be...
after lunch on a Saturday afternoon after the study.
Usually one would fix one would appoint a time beforehand. Usually when the monks come together at lunchtime, they say, I would like to speak to you, what would be a good time? And then the elder will give a good time. Yeah, we're still trying to settle what was a good time to speak to somebody. Yes, Simon, right?
Yes, Bante, can you explain a little bit, because I'm kind of confused that
yeah.
So, but why the and so many different applications. So how does that different topics apply to avoid conflict? Is this conflict avoid between the Buddha and his disciples, or between the teacher and the student? And also, I have second question. Sometimes that the conflict just cannot.
What is it? Usually, is the second question related to the first?
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes that the conflict cannot be avoided.
Yeah.
So if that's the situation, how do we do about that?
The first is an interesting question. I don't think it's a question of conflict between the Buddha and his students. It seems to me, this is just my conjecture, as I said, during the class, that it seems that the theme or the umbrella that brings all of these items together is the advice for a monk who's going to be expounding the Dhamma. And so this is sort of the proper things to do in teaching, maybe to avoid getting into conflict with the audience, with getting them confused, and maybe getting into conflict with others who might hear about one's talk and dispute with one. So like we have the thing about not extolling and not disparaging. So if one extols some people in the audience and then disparages others, it creates ill will between, it creates improper affection from those that one is praising and ill will from those one is disparaging. But instead one just teaches teaches the Dhamma, teaches the principle here, and then one lets those who are following either the wrong path or the right path come to their own decisions, since one is not directly speaking about them. And then, of course, in the case of speaking privately, what is true and beneficial, and speaking openly or in a group, what is sharp but also true and beneficial. Well, in the case of speaking privately, then one avoids conflict because then sort of ill will, entanglement, because one is not criticizing that person in a group in a way that will embarrass them. In the case where you have to speak sharply to somebody in the group, of course there might be some feeling of ill will and resentment, but probably in this case the need to correct that person, especially this would be a person who's not amenable to private advice, so that the whole group has to call that person in and speak harshly, speak to him sharply. In that case, some conflict is unavoidable, but it's necessary in order to straighten that person out. In the case of, for example, not adhering to local usage and not overriding common usage, in this way, one shows the flexibility in adapting one's teaching to the language, customs, expectations of the audience, and so one avoids conflict and feelings of ill will from the audience. So that is the first question. The second question was, what does one do? What does one do when conflict cannot be avoided? There's actually whole sets of teachings by the Buddha in various places on how to settle disputes, what to do when conflicts break out, and how to settle disputes. Of course, since the Buddha faced that situation within the monastic order, so most of them deal with, conflicts break out between monks. And so even to avoid conflicts in the first place, it's in the Anguttara Nikāya book of sixes. He teaches what are called the 6 roots of disputes. So he tells the monks that you should look into yourself. If you see any of these 6 roots of disputes, then you should abandon them. And actually, they turn out to be more than 6 because several of them are grouped into pairs of related items like ill will and hostility, envy and miserliness. So that I counted them, they come to 11 actually. And then also in the Book of Sixes, he speaks of 6 principles of harmony and respect. So these are ways to avoid disputes in the first place, by promoting harmony in bodily action, harmony in speech, harmony, or loving kindness in bodily action, loving kindness in speech, loving kindness in thoughts, then sharing the gains of the Sangha together, observing a common set of precepts, and together holding the view of the Buddha Dharma. Then there are more specific measures that come. I don't want to go into detail about them now. Do you know how to use that? There's the microphone part you have to put close to your mouth.
Yes.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, Bhante. I'm so glad I'm here today to listen to your talk. It is very surprise for me, and I'm so. I don't know what to say, but I'm really happy to be here today. Actually, okay, let me straight to the point. Actually, someone asked us a question about Abhidhamma.
Yeah.
And we cannot give them a very good answer because we also have a little doubt about our knowledge.
Yeah.
So today I would like to ask Bhante on behalf of them.
Yeah.
Actually, they asked us about Kamajja Rupa.
About?
Kamajja Rupa.
Oh, Kamajja Rupa.
Yes, is Bhava Rupa.
Bhava Rupa.
Yes, yes. So we know that in Bhava Rupa we have Burisa.
Yeah.
Yes, and we have Iti.
Yeah.
And we also know that according to this karma, according to our karma, we will be reborn as a man or as a woman. And this is natural way. But they ask like this. Nowadays in China, because of one-child policy, so most of parents in China, they just want to select Burisa Bhava.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
To select, to have a male child.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And what they did, they will go to a doctor and they will say, look, doctor, I want you to select Burisa Bhava. And then after that, you can put it to the wife, so that she can get a boy.
Yeah.
So in this way, they say, does it have anything to do with karma? Concerning with our intention, we have like we selected on our own will to have a certain child. So does it mean anything? Do you know what I mean?
Is there anybody from China here? From Dalu, from mainland China? I think China has abolished the one-child penalty. Is that correct? They stopped that policy already.
Yeah, but I mean before that.
Okay, before that.
This
and to my knowledge, there's no substance or medicine that one could take that will determine the sex of the child. Anybody? Is that correct? I mean, I'm not up to the latest in reproductive technologies, but I don't think that there is such a substance. If a doctor is prescribing anything and saying, you take this and you'll have a male child, he's treating the patient. The only way that the parents can be sure of having a male child is they do a prenatal screening of some sort, or test of, what do they call it? Sonogram, whereby they can determine the sex of the child, and then if they see that it's a female child, a female fetus, then they abort it. Correct?
But
I'm not saying that I approve of the. I mean, is my understanding correct? Yeah.
But in China, they actually have a pre-selected sex of a child. That means they will extract a cell from the father and cell from the mother and put it together somehow. I mean, the medical term I cannot describe, but they can select a cell as a male or female and put in the mother's womb. They can do that nowadays.
Oh, I see. Maybe they fertilize a bunch of egg cells, and then they can examine, was it the chromosomes, to see that they have the combination that will develop into a male child.
Right.
And then they will implant that one into the mother's womb.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. So in this case, Van Day, how do we determine this is karma or what is it?
You know, I can't. I don't know how to determine these things. Yeah, I could explain the Abhidhamma, but when it comes to some of these questions, the subtleties are beyond my powers of comprehension.
That's right, Bhante. I thank you so much for this confirmation, Bhante.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it seems to me that, I don't know, it seems to me to be, what do you call it, unwholesome karma, or unjust for people, or just socially unjust for people to in advance select the sex of their child rather than to leave it to chance, my opinion. Did you want to say something, Steve? You could take the microphone.
Actually, believe it or not, I think my question relates both to the Venerable's question and this sutta, because I was just recently talking to a monk who is American but translates many Chinese texts. And one of the texts he's been working on is about how couples in China can, through some kind of practice, select the sex by somehow matching up the Gandhabba to the parents in a somewhat mystical way. And I bring it up because when I heard this, I had a pretty strong aversion.
Yeah.
And, of non-conflict. And of course, I wanted to say, this is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And my question, I guess, is then, is it okay to even say this to a monk? Or should I just be quiet and just go away? Is it an okay way of engaging this discussion?
I think probably the most skillful way is not to disparage a monk himself for saying that, but to raise it in the form of we call it the rhetorical question. Like, don't you think that it shows a particularly biased attitude for parents to be performing a ritual to guarantee that they're going to have a male child rather than a female child? Is that the point?
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So one could put it in the form of, or you could say this doesn't quite seem right to me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, not. It's proper. Like not to sort of, if he's giving a lecture, not to be provocative. Okay, I think unless somebody has an urgent question, I think we have to stop for the day. Okay, so we'll end with 3 half bows to the Buddha.